Final Fantasy on the Nintendo Famicom paved the way in innovating more of the Japanese RPG format, and it would only pave the way of making the stellar title into a long-running franchise. The reception and sales were enough to innovate Hironobu Sakaguchi in wanting to create a sequel to the first game, but with the initial sales of 200,000 copies being sold in Japan, made him feel that it wouldn't be enough to warrant that need. Sakaguchi requested to Square Company to release an additional 200,000 copies so that the sales of those other copies would be enough to generate more money and demand for a sequel to get underway. Square obliged to his request. The 200,000 extra copies all managed to sell like crazy, and the demand for a sequel was set in stone. Development for the next installment of Final Fantasy began after the 200,000 extra copies of the first game were sold, and most of the team from the first game came back to put in their creative talent to make another entry. However, the only difference was that Sakaguchi was now in the chair of directing the game, while Masashi Miyamoto's father, Masafumi Miyamoto, was set to produce the game in Sakaguchi's stead. For the next entry, Sakaguchi commented that the first game was more about the gameplay and less on the story, considering that is how it necessarily went. So the next game would be the complete opposite, where it would be a balance between the gameplay, but to also add in more emphasis of storytelling and character development, whereas he wanted the characters to feel like real human beings. While no concrete ideas were given to the game as to where it needed to go in direction, Sakaguchi used the experiences that he gained while creating the first game and to work on the production board for something new and original that wouldn't follow around the story or the world that the first game was built after. As mentioned, most of the team from the first game came back with Nobuo Uematsu providing the music, Yoshitaka Amano providing character designs and the title logo illustration, Kenji Terada writing the scenario based on the story that Sakaguchi planned out, as well as Hiromichi Tanaka, Akitoshi Kawazu, and Koichi Ishii returning and designing the game. Kazuko Shibuya would return with providing the design of the character sprites, while Ryoko Tanaka would assist Shibuya as another graphics designer in most other areas. Nasir Gabelli would also return as the game's main programmer, but he had to leave to go back home in Sacramento, California due to his work visa expiring halfway through development. A team of programmers followed Gabelli back to the United States with all the necessary materials, and they helped Sakaguchi finish up production of the game while working from overseas. On the day before the first anniversary of the first game's release in Japan, Final Fantasy II was released amongst the Japanese public on December 17, 1988. Final Fantasy II is set in a world where the Palamecian Empire wishes for supreme conquest of their world while the weak are succumbed by their massive superpower. Away from those who suffered the Empire's wrath, resistance fortresses were built to stand up against the menacing Emperor as their constant battles remained ongoing to this day. The story revolves around four friends who sought in working together to thwart against the Palamecian forces while gaining strength and magic through a number of trials and challenges that await them. These four heroes would be led by Firion, who is a resident to the country of Fynn, and a weapons master who can manage to wield a sword, axe, spear, bow, staff, dagger, and use his fists. Maria is a childhood friend of Firion and hopes to defeat the Empire to save her brother. Guy is another childhood friend of Firion and Maria, and will only speak in a stunted manner while having a very unique ability to speak to wildlife. Finally, there is Leon, Maria's older brother as well as childhood friend to Firion and Guy, and he was warped into being a new Dark Knight to the Emperor after he went missing during the assault on Fynn. The story would revolve around mostly on Firion, Maria, and Guy, while Firion would be the leader, and they would gain temporary companions such as Minwu, Joseph, Gordon, Layla, Ricard Highwind, and Ced, who helped them out with numerous tasks, and most of them would be succumbed to a terrible fate. Final Fantasy II's setting does not revolve around the four crystals like the first game, as Sakaguchi wanted to hit character development as first priority than anything. Even the plot would have a striking resemblance to that of Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. The story begins when Fynn is attacked by the Imperial army of Palamecia. Firion, Maria, Guy, and Leon try and escape from the ongoing wrath of the Emperor's power, but they are struck down by the Imperial soldiers and left to die while Leon is taken away. The other three are taken to a rebellion camp near a town called Altair, and they are saved by Finn's princess Hilda, who establishes a rebel base known as the Wild Rose Rebellion. Firion and his friends eagerly request the princess for them to join her rebellion, but are refused after claiming that they are inexperienced from what they encountered when trying to escape their village. Willing to prove that they have what it takes to join, the group travels to their destroyed town of Fynn to search for Leon, but they end up meeting a dying prince from Kashwan named Prince Scott, who is revealed to be Princess Hilda's fiancé. Scott delivers the message to Firion and his friends that a former knight of Kashwan named Borgin has betrayed the rebellion and became a top general for the Imperial army. Shocked by this outcome, The three warriors return to Altair and inform the princess of Scott's demise and Borgen's betrayal. At last, Varian and his friends are welcomed into the Wild Rose Rebellion, to where they hope they can achieve a dream of sharing the message of what the rebel group stands for. A world full of wild roses, where they can bring new life after the onslaught of destruction in its previous wake. The first mission is for Varian, Maria, and Guy to travel north to find Mithril that will help them in the process of creating powerful weapons and armor to resist the Empire even more. Their travels lead them to Salamand, a village that is occupied by the Empire, where all the villagers are being treated as slaves and forced to work in the nearby mines. The group of Imperials is defeated by Varian and his crew, and Salamand is liberated from slavery, as the villagers praise them as heroes and give them the Mithril as their way of thanking them for their freedom. For the next mission, Princess Hilda informs the group to undertake a mission in the city of Bafsk, to where they must prevent the construction of a powerful Imperial warship called the Dreadnought. Varian arrives at the city of Bafsk, but is too late to stop construction of the warship as the Dreadnought starts flying in the sky. Immediately, Varian and his friends learn that the only weapon that can destroy the Dreadnought by all means is a weapon called the Sunfire, that can be used as a last resort. The three warriors locate and retrieve the Sunfire, but they end up watching helplessly when the Empire has an abducted Princess Hilda on the ship, which forces them to undergo a rescue mission when the ship stocks on supplies. Rescuing the princess becomes a success, and the destruction of the Dreadnought follows suit. Afterwards, Varian and his friends encounter a Dark Knight, who Maria claims to be very familiar by his voice. Other parts of the game end up with the team traveling to the city of dragoons called Dazed to help the last Wyvern as a means of assisting them to strike the Emperor firsthand after the rest of the dragons were killed by Imperial poison. Finn and the Wild Rose Rebellion have been taken over by Palamecia, but Varian manages to liberate the kingdom and the fortress after rescuing the princess once more. The next mission leads Varian to travel west for a powerful magic item, and they encounter the last surviving dragoon that helps them along the way. The return to Finn leaves the heroes in seeing that many towns were destroyed by a cyclone created by the Emperor. The newly born Wyvern is asked for its help to send them into the castle that is protected by the cyclone, and the heroes manage to find the Emperor and kill him for his treacherous acts. Victory is celebrated in Finn, but is cut short when a wounded soldier from the kingdom claims that the Dark Knight, who is revealed to be Leon, has become the new Emperor and plans to destroy the rebels with the Imperial army. Varian, Maria, and Guy hurry to confront Leon, but they are greeted by the Emperor, who appears in a newly demonic form, and he claims to have risen from hell to bring destruction to all living things, whether if they are good or evil. Varian, Maria, Guy, and Leon escape from the castle with the Wyvern, and the Emperor replaces his castle with the Palace of Hell, Pandemonium. Leon agrees to help his friends make one final stand against the Emperor, and they travel to the Jade Passage of the Hellish Palace to the portal that sends them into the underworld. There they face off against the demonic Emperor and finally put an end to his tyranny. Leon objects in returning home, as his crimes would not be forgiven for being used as a puppet in the Imperial army, but Varian refuses and says that he will be gladly welcomed back in open arms by his friends, sister, and everyone who helped bring a new age of peace upon their world. Similar to the first game, Final Fantasy II's gameplay allowed gamers to freely roam a world map, enter battles and grow in strength, traverse through towns and dungeons, use supported magic spells outside of battles such as Cure, saving a game's progress through the world map, which the first game did not do at the time, purchasing weapons, armor, items, and magic abilities through the shops, and talking to townspeople who provide useful information to help the player progress through the game. One of the newest features about the conversation aspect when speaking to the many non-playable characters was that anyone could ask information from NPCs where they may provide useful terms to help them unlock newer actions when they memorize them with a special function when talking. This function would be known as the word memory system. Similarly, there are certain items one can give to specific characters or place on certain objects to unlock newer rewards that offered a resembling effect as the word memory system. Characters and monsters are no longer separated into two separate windows, as they each were on the same battle map than the first game, and the player can see a character's full HP and MP from below the battle. Plus, this game allowed gamers to fight with less than 4 party members in a battle, which the first game was not capable of. Final Fantasy II was also the first game in the series to introduce one of the mascots that became very popular to this day, the Chocobo. Chocobos are used as a means to travel to various places on the world map without being attacked by enemies in the process. This made it easier for players who need a break from grinding and more of a quick means to get somewhere really fast. The other key element that was introduced in this game that would be a staple in all other installments was the character named Cid. Cid in Final Fantasy II is a former White Knight of Finn, but gave up that title to enjoy building airships. He gives Varian the information about how to destroy the Dreadnought with the lack of Sunfire, and he is fatally injured later on when the Emperor's Cyclone came forth, and died later on, and helps the perished from hell stop the Emperor's destructive reign from the underworld, and their souls are sent to heaven after his defeat. Probably the game's most noticeable feature would be the growth system. Unlike the first game, Firion and his allies do not gain experience points from fighting monsters, as their strength and all statistics would grow based on what actions they took and how much damage they sustained from foes. Plus, their affinity with weapons would grow the more they used them, and the accuracy and power would only get bigger from here on out. However, there is a double-edged sword to the ordeal, as certain statistics would gradually deteriorate if they were not used that much at all. The fighting system would receive an upgrade, as most of the fundamentals of the first game were intact, but the newest addition was having front row and back row characters to give them advantages and disadvantages to where they are placed. Front row characters could attack more powerfully, but receive more damage, while back row characters would be weaker in power, but have better defenses in the process. Some weapons are not beneficial to the front row, like staves and bows, as they are more used to attack from the back, with staves being used to cast powerful spells, and bows can be used to shoot arrows from longer distances. This is another feature that would be used in later Final Fantasy games to give more variables on how one can fight within a conflict. The game's design was on par to that of the first game, but there are some updates such as having a bit more color and better design of the portraits for the enemies placed in battle. Visually, it may have been the answer to Sakaguchi wanting to improve the design aspect, as he may have been under the impression that the first Final Fantasy was already declared as being visually outdated. Musically, Final Fantasy II's soundtrack was given a bigger facelift as much as almost everything else within the game. Nobuo Uematsu had a knack for wanting to keep Final Fantasy a game where the emphasis of an adventure with light tones would be big to grip more people into the experience. However, Sakaguchi's approach with the story for Final Fantasy II would be far darker and more serious in contrast to the first game, where the lighthearted and adventurous tones that was delivered in the soundtrack. Since Final Fantasy II's soundtrack was more brooding and tragic based around the narrative, Sakaguchi wanted Uematsu to create songs with a more sinister atmosphere and some that have a tragic vibe to them based on some of the temporary companions either succumbing to a terrible fate or dying in the plot like Cid has. When Nobuo Uematsu was told about this, he wasn't very keen and receptive toward the idea because of how far down the game went in terms of the narrative, but he grew to be more accepting towards those ideas over time. Some of the most noticeable themes were the Rebel Army theme, which symbolizes a team of liberators who want to free the world from control of a corrupted faction, and another would be the Town of Magi, where the Mysidian Tower would give gamers a feeling of unease when hearing the high-pitched vibrato in this mysterious melancholy song. Some of the other iconic themes like the battle theme and victory fanfare would make a return in different renditions, but the one that set the foundation for the series would be the arranged rendition of the Prelude theme, which would be carried on to all other subsequent sequels in the coming years. Final Fantasy II had another compelling soundtrack, and Uematsu pushed the boundaries of having compelling compositions in the whole game once more. Final Fantasy II on the Famicom was released to very positive reception in Japan at the time. Much of the praise was given to the scenario that was conceived by Hironobu Sakaguchi, as the story made the characters very relatable, with many hardships they go through with the loss of comrades to the destruction of places that yearn for freedom. Plus, many of them thought that the growth system was very interesting as it opened many possibilities to how one can grow their party. However, as more time has passed, and in complete contrast to the original game, Final Fantasy II on the Famicom had a more mixed reception from modern critics, while fan reception ended up being extremely negative overall. While praise was given to the game's growth system when fighting the many random enemy and boss battles, it was also considered to be one out of two of the game's biggest shortcomings. The problem with the growth system required the character to undergo many random battles in order to get anywhere when it comes to growing Firion and his party, and the constant need for grinding in order to get anywhere in the game would be detrimental to its overall flow. To speed things up faster for players, they would resort to using the infamous target cancel bug in order to grind a character's individual stats in the weapons and magic. While it would help many get through some of the hurdles they would eventually go up against, it still wouldn't make up for Final Fantasy II's unbalanced nature in the difficulty, especially in the game's final dungeon. Because of everything in a character being completely individualized for their growth in overall strength, the unbalanced and frustrating difficulty in the game's final areas would almost make the game nearly unplayable and unbeatable to most others. Plus, it didn't help with the items being completely individualized instead of holding a set quantity of them for players to continuously use if they were stuck in a tight spot. Despite the game's shortcomings it had for itself, many still consider it to be worthy of the Final Fantasy name because of its story and characters, but more as the black sheep when it came to the overall gameplay. Sales for Final Fantasy II on the Famicom were not disclosed since it never saw a release outside of Japan, but it was later noted by Square's publicity department that the game had doubled over the original sales with over 800,000 units sold. Ironically, Final Fantasy II was set to be localized for the Western market for the NES after the strong reception and sales of the first game. Squaresoft, the North American subsidiary of Square, was busy with working on an English-language localization for Final Fantasy II to be released in North America under the title Final Fantasy II: Dark Shadow over Palakia. Kaoru Moriyama would be assigned as the head translator for the game to be released in North America at the time. Although a beta version was produced with it being advertised through Square's trade publications, the long development time and age of the original Japanese version with the Nintendo's successor console, the SNES, coming along the way, forced the localization team to cancel the Final Fantasy II release because of them being more in favor of localizing Final Fantasy IV instead. However, this was also more along the fact with how the game wasn't fully accessible because of its flaws. Although the prototype cartridge of the NES Final Fantasy II was produced with the subtitle remaining intact, Moriyama's own admission made him declare that the project was still far from complete. He quoted, "We had so very limited memory capacity that we could use for each game, and it was never really translating, but chopping up the information and cramming them back in. Additionally, our boss had no understanding in putting in extra work for the English version at the time." Before the official English release of Final Fantasy II was released in 2003, a fan translation was already created prior to its release in the North American market, and makes use of an original translation as the existence of the prototype cartridge was not common knowledge at the time. Just like the first game, Final Fantasy II was ported, re-released, and remade on several different platforms. The first re-release came in 1994, as it was on the Nintendo Famicom that acted as a 2 games in 1 pack, where the first Final Fantasy was attached to it. This version didn't have anything new for Final Fantasy II, as the first game was updated with some minor graphical changes. The first remake came in the year 2000 for the WonderSwan Color, and it included a huge amount of graphical updates in the character sprites, a total revamping of battlefield and dungeon backgrounds, and higher resolution overall. The next remake came in the PS1 Enhanced Remake compilation called Final Fantasy Origins, where the first 2 games were remade and packaged onto 1 CD. This version increased the resolution by a marginal amount, and the processing power for the PlayStation made it possible for there to be a full-motion video scene, a bestiary, an art gallery by Yoshitaka Amano, and an item collection gallery. Plus, there are 2 modes of difficulty to play on. Most of the music from this version to all future versions were handled and remixed by Tsuyoshi Sakido, who composed music for Brave Fencer Musashi, The Last Remnant, and Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep, as well as Kingdom Hearts 3D Dream Drop Distance with Yoko Shimomura. The next update came onto the Game Boy Advance in another enhanced remake compilation of the first 2 games, where it was called Final Fantasy I and II Dawn of Souls. Several tweaks were made in the game's growth system, where the stat decreases were completely omitted to give the game more accessibility, and the removal of the action cancel bug. This version of Final Fantasy II also brought in a new scenario called Souls of Rebirth, and it acted as a separate alternate storyline based on the playable characters who died during the main storyline, as they must find the light side of the Emperor to ask him for forgiveness that will grant them passage into heaven. The PlayStation Portable remake came with higher resolution 2D sprites, the retaining of the Dawn of Souls script and Souls of Rebirth scenario, and an all-new arcane labyrinth that acted as a new dungeon upon completing the game, where players can fight off against newer bosses. A port of the PlayStation Portable remake had recently been made available on the Apple App Store for the iPhone. This version doesn't include anything new, except for touchscreen controls to take advantage of the iPhone's touchscreen features. Numerous updates have been made to the game on the iPhone to better suit the newer versions of the product when they released. As anyone can see, the amount of re-releases were as big as the first, but not that surpassing in terms of how much it has been ported, remade, and re-released than its predecessor. To this day, it still remains very debatable about which version is regarded as the truly definitive version. Most would say the GBA version because of it completely removing the stat decreasing in the growth system, but some may say the PSP version for the refinements in all aspects, including the bonus material not present in others. The original Final Fantasy II on the Famicom is now available on the Wii's Virtual Console like the first game, but it is only made available in Japan. This makes it virtually impossible for the Western audience to get their hands on this game in its original form, but fan translation images of the game have been floating around the internet for people to check it out. Many believe to this day that Final Fantasy II remains as being Hironobu Sakaguchi's weakest entry that he has ever worked on for the series. People felt very accustomed to the first game in terms of its difficulty and rewarding experiences based on the progression and direction of where they had to go to complete the overall storyline. While Sakaguchi's work on story and character development were to be at full priority for this title, some believe that those aspects became overshadowed by the repetitive and unrewarding nature of the battles as well as the skill-based advancement system that many characters had to spend so much time and effort trying to master because of there being rewards and consequences based on what actions they took or left out altogether. Final Fantasy II's story still remains as one of the greatest ones ever made, as the forthcoming of storytelling and character development started to come more into its prime to be more used in later installments as of now. While the skill-based advancement system was not executed and perfected very well, it would be tweaked and more defined in later games and series such as Final Fantasy Legend 1 and 2 on the Game Boy and the Saga Frontier sub-series on the PlayStation. This feature would also be a refinement in the most current entry in the series, Final Fantasy XIV Online. Final Fantasy II may be considered as being the black sheep of Hironobu Sakaguchi's work, but it should be noted that he only set some of the recurring staples to be cherished in later works that would prove to be even bigger, better, and more superior to the overall legacy. As seeing that many video games were getting a trilogy treatment before those franchises ended up jumping ship onto the Super Famicom, Hironobu Sakaguchi thought it would be very fitting to make one last game on Nintendo's current system before bringing the series into the 16-bit generation. Seeing as how the reception on Final Fantasy II was not greater than the first game, but still great in its own right, the development team spent over a year with going back to basics by bringing in newer ideas as well as more balance between the story and gameplay. This installment would not only be the last one on the Famicom, but it would be the largest and most ambitious title to grace the 8-bit system to ever use its full potential with 512 kilobytes of memory, something that not most NES Famicom games took full advantage of during its life cycle. The original development team of the first two games came back for one last installment on the Famicom before its life cycle ended, and with most of the team preparing to ensue other projects. Nobuo Uematsu provided his talents with the music once more, Hironobu Sakaguchi returned as the director and base story planner, Yoshitaka Amano provided the character designs and title logo illustration again, Masafumi Miyamoto was reassigned as the producer, Hiromichi Tanaka came back as a designer along with newcomer Kazuhiko Aoki, and Kenji Terada put in his talent as the scenario writer for the story that Sakaguchi planned out. Nasir Gabelli and his team of programmers remained in Sacramento, California to work on the game from overseas, but this would be his last entry of Final Fantasy to work on. For nearly 16 months of development, Final Fantasy III would release to the Japanese public on April 27, 1990 for the Nintendo Famicom. Final Fantasy II changed very drastically from the first game, where its staple of the crystals being one of the themes in the story proved to be a trademark aspect, so Sakaguchi decided to bring back that icon so that he could create a better story out of them, as he wanted to cherish the idea of having 4 characters ending up being the Warriors of Light to bring back balance into their own world. The setting of Final Fantasy III would be set on an unnamed planet, where its backstory predates 1,000 years before the present time. In that history, a technologically advanced civilization that exists on a floating continent above the skies of the game's world sought to seek the power of the crystals of light. They did not even take into account that such a task could not be easily achieved, as the civilization could not control such fundamental forces of nature. The power of light would have consumed the world itself if the light crystals did not have their counterparts, the 4 elemental dark crystals, keeping the balance of nature in check. A sudden disturbance came about during the balance of light and darkness, and 4 warriors were granted the power of the dark crystals to recapture the power of their counterparts. The Dark Warriors succeeded in restoring harmony to the world, but were too late to save the doomed civilization. Their culture was reduced to nothing but inexhaustible ruin, though their floating continent still remained. On that continent, a circle of Golgans, a race of blind soothsayers, predicted that these events would ultimately repeat themselves throughout time. At the present, the game pits the player in a band of 4 unnamed protagonists who are orphans that reside from the same village, and the player must guide them around the floating continent, the whole world, and bring back balance onto the world from an evil entity who wishes to bring their world and the floating continent into an endless void. At the beginning, an earthquake occurs on the land near a village called where it grants the protagonist passage into the mysterious altar cave to the north. 4 orphans from the village travel to the cave where they discover the inside and a shrine that holds one of the 4 crystals of light. The crystal grants the children a portion of its power, as they would need it to restore the balance of light and darkness onto the whole world. Not knowing the crystal's pronouncements, but taking its words into strong account, the orphans tell their adoptive families that they are destined to embark on a journey to save their world and the floating continent from any further disturbances. Their journey begins with bringing them to realize that there is a whole world that is underneath the floating continent, which they are currently living. In the world below, they learn that a warlock named Zonde, one of the 3 apprentices to the Archmage Noah, is trying to possess the crystals of light to bring chaos and disorder together. In the process, they help Princess Sarah of Sasune Castle with defeating Ajin, who has caused a terrible curse upon her own people, the airship engineer Sid, who assists the heroes in traveling to more hard-to-reach areas to undergo their mission, and Dash, who turns out to be a guardian that protects the Tower of Owen that keeps the floating continent up and about. The Warriors of Light end up journeying through the lower world, and they assist a band of 4 old men that helps them defeat a rich aristocrat who is holding their ship hostage, the Prince of Saronia named Aulus, who is trying to stop his father from bringing about any more ruin based on a civil war going on in his home country, and receiving great help from the other 2 of Noah's apprentices, Doga and Une. The kids eventually arrive at the Crystal Tower, where they learn that Zonde is being manipulated by the evil deity called the Cloud of Darkness, and she is the source of all the recent events that are happening. The Cloud of Darkness attempts to bring back a similar situation to the Flood of Light that occurred over a millennia before the beginning, so that the whole world could be pulled into the void. Following the Cloud of Darkness in their tracks, the 4 warriors find themselves in a domain that houses the Dark Crystals, and where the Warriors of Darkness are being held prisoner from a long sleep. The Light Warriors free them, and they all combine their strength to put an end to the Cloud of Darkness once and for all. Final Fantasy III's gameplay is more of a combination between the first 2 games, but newer changes take place. The active time battle system returns from Final Fantasy 1 and 2, but the newest feature is that the damage on the main characters and enemies are taken out of the windows and placed above them for compressed use of the user interface that was originally in place. Auto-targeting after a friendly or enemy character is killed originates in this title, but it does not go for magical-based attacks, as this feature is prominent for physical-based attacks. One of the elements that made Final Fantasy really great was the experience point system that Final Fantasy II completely omitted, so it makes a return after its absence from before. From Final Fantasy III until newer and more subsequent entries in both the main series and its spin-offs that became revolutionary is the update of the character job system. For the first time in a Final Fantasy game, characters are given the option to select different jobs during the course of the story to reflect on the certain abilities and features that are needed to go through specific points throughout the game, whether if they are for certain puzzles or boss fights. Aside from the warrior, thief, white mage, black mage, monk, and red mage jobs from the first game, newer jobs include ranger, viking, knight, dragoon, black belt, dark knight, ninja, geomancer, scholar, evoker, bard, magus, devout, summoner, and sage. Plus, the 4 protagonists each start off with the Onion Knight job as their default setting. All those variables mean that there are a grand total of 22 jobs to choose from than before, along with 14,590 different party configurations to go through, a vast improvement over the first game. Each of these jobs would give characters brand new abilities not seen from past games, such as the Thief having the ability to steal items from enemies and bosses, the Dragoon having the jump ability to do an aerial strike from above, the Summoner having the ability to call forth powerful deities called Eidolons to unleash heavy damage on foes, and so much more. The only downside about the character job system is that all jobs are not available on the go, as players would have to hunt down the Crystals of Light, as each of them will grant them a set of newer jobs that will eventually add up to all that are available. This makes the game feel as if the player is growing for something completely new that they can take advantage of, so some may feel that mastering the selected jobs for newer ones came down as a very rewarding experience in comparison to the previous entry. Speaking of which, grinding for newer levels and the hunt for Gil in this game came back from the past 2 games, and the programmers went above and beyond with the difficulty and dedication for the player. Most of the bosses in the game would come off as unrelenting, and the necessity for grinding the party and mastering their jobs were a more definitive priority than before. The one thing that made Final Fantasy more superior to Final Fantasy II was the challenge and creativity of the caves and dungeons. Final Fantasy III brought back that aspect, but the designs were given a makeover to make them appear more gratuitous than uncreative. Another one of the game's most defining features that stood out far more than the first game was the inclusion of side quests. While side quests are not that uncommon with the first game, such as getting Excalibur after fighting Adamantite, certain side quests such as the Cave of Bahamut and the Saronia Catacombs would allow players to seek out 2 of the most powerful Eidolons to fight on their side, as well as certain dungeons giving access to some of the most powerful equipment that they can achieve. Extra filler like this would carry on in later installments that would give the player a bigger sense of urgency to become more stronger and less weak. One final aspect in the gameplay that has changed was the presentation of the battle system. Aside from the changes of Final Fantasy II being present in Final Fantasy III, the windows for the commands and character enemy names were all changed in color from black to blue to take heed in the change of the game's design. Ironically, the game has received a huge update in terms of the graphics. While the sprites and backgrounds may seem very similar to the past entries, the color scheme was expanded and improved upon by taking advantage of the Famicom's cartridge being maxed out to 512 kilobytes of memory, so this made it possible to expand more on the colors than having a select few. With the maxed out memory of the Famicom's game cartridge, Final Fantasy III became not only an impressive boost in many new gameplay mechanics, but an impressive boost to the design that gave many opportunities to make small games become even more expanded upon than before. As Final Fantasy III became a maxed out game of memory for the Famicom, one would think that it would be the perfect opportunity to improve upon the music to its full potential. It truly does, as Nobuo Uematsu sought to make the music the best he has done for the NES Famicom. One of these songs that would make Final Fantasy III definitive was its main theme called Eternal Wind. Since Final Fantasy III is more of a mixture of the lighthearted, adventurous tones from the first game and the dark, melancholy tones of the second game, Eternal Wind portrays the need for adventure, but it gives off the feeling that the player must dedicate the 4 protagonists on their mission to save their world. Another iconic piece was Pavillon of Doga and Une, that represented the theme of both characters respectively. Doga and Une are old and wise magus characters who were once students of the great magus named Noah, a powerful magic-based user who sealed Leviathan and Bahamut on the floating continent. This theme reflects the personas of Doga being filled with vast knowledge of magic, and Une's absolute control of the dream world, since they appear aged with their knowledge and absolute control, respectively. Finally, one other piece of music that was very memorable was the theme called Crystal Tower. This music takes place in the second-to-last dungeon in the game, and its tune gave players the expression to hurry and finish the fight before the cloud of darkness ends up destroying all. All of these tunes are just as memorable as every other game before this one, so the limited hardware from the Famicom gave Uematsu the opportunity to place in more 8-bit sounds to the chiptune set than being restricted to a limited set of about 1 or 2. Out of all the games in the Famicom Trilogy for Final Fantasy, this game stands out as the best by far in Uematsu's work. Final Fantasy III released on April 27, 1990 in Japan, and it has received very positive praise from Japanese gaming publications like Famitsu, but the actual scores outside of Japan remain as a mystery to the Western audience, since the game never officially released until 2006. Most of the reviews from the general public and fans on the internet have been greatly positive as well. Most of them were very pleased with the huge step taken up after Final Fantasy II in terms of the improved gameplay, great story development, musical tunes, and overall design. Many even felt that the game was far more rewarding than the previous game, as the knack for learning newer jobs with the 22 different types to choose from only added more variables on how one would combine the strength and attributes of the different jobs to benefit the protagonists in the battles. The story was more streamlined, as it would be easier for gamers to follow along with what all went on from beginning to end. Many of those who reviewed this game would go as far to say that this entry is the best that Square has ever made on the Famicom. However, not everything in the game is perfect, as some believe that the dungeons came off as a bit too short, and some of the design aspects in the characters and locations were recycled with no effort to improve on the detail. Regardless, Final Fantasy III became another huge success for Square, and it would exceed the sales of Final Fantasy II by moving over 1,400,000 units. While the Famicom original did not make it to Western shores, localization for this game was never considered to make its presence enter the light of day. This was because the Super Nintendo Entertainment System was starting to become more mainstream, and the consumer interest started to migrate toward that than the NES, which was already 5 to 6 years old. Square was also busy working on Final Fantasy games on the Super Famicom that it literally became impossible to work localization for this game at that time. Hiromichi Tanaka gave an official quote toward this decision. Nowadays, we know that when you've got a platform like PlayStation, you'll have PlayStation 2, and then PlayStation 3, and where you've got Xbox, you move on to Xbox 360. You can sort of assume what's going to happen in the future. But back then, that was the first time that we'd seen a new generation of consoles, and it was really difficult to predict what was going to happen. At that time then, we were working so hard to catch up on the new technology that we didn't have enough manpower to work on an English version of Final Fantasy III. Not only that, but Square's preoccupation with the SNES stated that an English language translation of the game would have required over 1 megabyte of ROM space to make the translation become a reality, but the process would not have been cost effective. Other than that, Final Fantasy III would remain a mystery to the Western world for many years to come. Final Fantasy III was bound to be ported, re-released, and remade for numerous platforms just like the other games before this one, but Final Fantasy III wasn't milked to death like the first two games. Since this game was the last to release on the Famicom, Square hardly saw this entry as being profitable for numerous re-releases. However, this game entered the train of re-releases regardless. What's really interesting was that this game was slated to be remade for the WonderSwan color like Final Fantasy I and II, but it ended up getting cancelled altogether. What happened was that the Famicom Trilogy was all meant to be re-released for Bandai's handheld within the year after the WonderSwan color released in Japan. After Final Fantasy I and II released for the handheld, Final Fantasy III ended up getting delayed even after Bandai picked up the publishing rights. Surprisingly, a port of the next Final Fantasy game was already being worked on for the WonderSwan color, and Square started to become more silent on Final Fantasy III's development for the system. While the remake was never formally cancelled by Square, the official website for the WonderSwan color version of Final Fantasy III was taken offline after production of the handheld officially ceased in 2002. Hiromichi Tanaka had another quote to deliver on Final Fantasy III not seeing the light of day on Bandai's handheld. When we developed Final Fantasy III, the volume of content in the game was so huge that the cartridge was completely full, and when new platforms emerged, there simply wasn't enough storage space available for an update of Final Fantasy III, because that would have required new graphics, music, and other content. There was also a difficulty with how much manpower it would take to remake all of that content. As seeing that Final Fantasy III couldn't get remade on something with limited hardware as much as the NES Famicom, this made gamers wonder if Final Fantasy III was going to remain a mystery throughout time. Surprisingly enough, that was not the case. Hiromichi Tanaka took to heart on the Final Fantasy III remake as he decided to move its development elsewhere after Square merged with its former competitor Enix to make Square Enix in 2003. Some probably thought that Final Fantasy III would see its way onto the PlayStation 2 or the Game Boy Advance, since Final Fantasy games seemed to be more a home towards Sony's consoles, and remakes on the Game Boy Advance were becoming more popular. Although Square Enix considered making a PlayStation 2 remake of Final Fantasy III, they were convinced by Nintendo to make it possible on their successor handheld, known as the Nintendo DS, which proved to be positively reinforced based on the success in the huge sales during the first 2 years of its life cycle. The remake was revived and first announced on October 24, 2004, but more details would come about a year later. This remake would have 3D polygon models and environments, an opening full-motion video sequence, a partially revamped story where the 4 protagonists would be named and originate from different locations near the original hometown from the Famicom original, and another updated job system where a new job called the Freelancer job was formed and to where all jobs would receive more balance. Hiromichi Tanaka took the reign of executive producer and director of the title, while a new employee for Square Enix named Tomoya Asano would be producing it. Other veterans like Akihiko Yoshida would provide the character designs over Yoshitaka Amano, as he had little to no involvement in the DS remake. Not to mention, Nobuo Uematsu was unable to come back while being stuck on other projects at the time, so it would be handled by the likes of Tsuyoshi Sekito and Keiji Kawamori to provide musical and sound arrangements of the themes that were present from before. Square Enix did not fully develop the remake as they had help from a company called Matrix Software to handle the programming altogether. Matrix Software developed games for the PlayStation 2, and the Nintendo DS before coming onto the project of Final Fantasy III DS. They have become well known for one of the most famous PS1 titles that received a huge cult following called Alundra, and it was a game with inspired gameplay like the Legend of Zelda series, where the narrative was very dark in comparison. Matrix Software also worked on some of the Dragon Quest games and the remakes, to where they formed a strong relationship with Square Enix to make Final Fantasy III's remake on the DS a reality. Plus, the remake took advantage of the Nintendo Wi-Fi capabilities to include the Mail Magnet system to message other Moogles, other players, and gain access to newer side quests not found in the original game. With the updated story, balanced gameplay in terms of the battles and job system, 3D graphics, and remixed soundtrack to fit with the times, Final Fantasy III became more public domain to the whole world, as Western territories would get its hands on the game for the first time. The reception revolving around Final Fantasy III DS was overwhelmingly positive, despite the critics claiming that this entry remained unknown to the Western fanbase, and this remake would be enough to garner the interest of Final Fantasy fans and JRPG enthusiasts alike. So far, the game has sold over 2 million copies worldwide, where a vast majority of those sales were from Japan and North America alone. It would also come as no surprise as to how streamlined the Nintendo DS was to garner more consumer interest, so sales of that game would be much larger than before. The DS remake was the first re-release that managed to help Final Fantasy III break into public domain, and all subsequent re-releases were based on the DS remake, with the first being re-released on the iOS for the Apple iPhone, where the graphics and music were improved, and certain functions were removed like the Mail Magnet system, and certain side quests like finding the Unite job function being changed. The iOS port also utilized the iPhone's capability of touchscreen controls to move the characters, talk to people, and execute commands in battle. A port of the iOS version was made available on the Android smartphones via the Google Play App Store, and the most recent re-release was made available on the PSP, where it marks the PlayStation brand where all the main entries of Final Fantasy ended up being playable in one form or the other. Not only that, but a high-definition port of the DS remake has made its way onto the Ouya, a console with an Android-based operating system that is meant for indie developers to develop and publish their games on there without the help of big-name publishers, and Final Fantasy III was made as a launch title for the Android console. Even the HD re-release on the Ouya made its way to Steam in 2014. As of right now, the original Final Fantasy III on the Famicom is available on the Wii Virtual Console for Japan only, and this gives the Japanese consumers a chance for newcomers to try it out, while older folks relive the memories of this gem. Final Fantasy III remains as being a largely underrated entry because of the original game not being localized in the long run. Even those who praised the DS remake and tried it out for the first time have labeled Final Fantasy III as being one of the most underrated games ever to grace a platform. Its mystery and absence in the Western world made the game become overshadowed by the more powerful entries that were soon to arrive. Even those who managed to get their hands on the Famicom version via the original cartridge can see what exactly that they have missed out, since it never released beyond Japan until 1.5 decades later. Even those who played the original when comparing it to Final Fantasy 1 and 2 have entered their verdict that Final Fantasy 3 remains as being the best entry in the Famicom Trilogy, where it fixes most of the flaws that both the first two games had within them at the time. The foundation of the changeable job system would be another staple that Hironobu Sakaguchi would leave for the series with the more subsequent entries that arrived in the following years, and it would be a staple in most of the spin-offs in this day and age. One other addition that he brought about were the Moogles that made their first appearance, as they would make another cameo in the series' 5th installment, as well as having more active roles in later outings. Whether Final Fantasy III will be remade or re-released on newer platforms in the coming future will be left unknown to the fans, but its legacy has been long-lasting that many Western gamers did not know about when playing the more recent titles in the franchise. Final Fantasy III would become the last entry where all the original team members of the Famicom Trilogy would work together to bring these hard but challenging entries to the public before many of them went their separate ways with newer IPs that had influence from Final Fantasy in some way or another. The only three people who remained with the Final Fantasy brand would be the creator, the character designer, and the composer, Hironobu Sakaguchi, Yoshitaka Amano, and Nobuo Uematsu. Sakaguchi was left to expand the Final Fantasy lore with newer and younger talent, and the completion of Final Fantasy III only marked the beginning of a long and unilateral journey for him and the series. Next time on Double RPG's Final Fantasy Retrospective. Final Fantasy takes a jump from the 8-bit era to the 16-bit era on the Super Famicom, and we are going to take a look at a game where the story of the Crystals of Light and Darkness revolve around characters with unchangeable classes, and one where the main theme of the Warriors of Light would make one last comeback, but with the touch being almost completely lost.